Pools closed to unregistered guests, Marcus said, chin tilted like a judge on a stage. He snapped his fingers at the guard. A shoulder hit my daughter. Metal rang as Claire stumbled into the fence, breath catching. Chlorine stung the air, and neighbors froze mid-step, phones twitching in their hands. "Stop," I said, phone already raised. "Touch her again, and the evidence lives forever." His smirk faltered. "You're not allowed to record." "I train police how to preserve evidence," I answered, voice calm. "This is a common area. No privacy expectation. And this stream doesn't stop at my phone. It's mirrored off-site. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "David Whitmore, cybercrime analyst, husband to a woman who taught swimming here before cancer took her, father to the girl you just shoved." I felt anger simmer, but my tone stayed steady. "This pool is her memory. You won't weaponize it." His whistle clinked against his keys as he gestured to the sign. "Guest list violation. Rules are rules, rules." That fence wasn't just chain link. It was where my wife leaned to laugh with dripping hair, where Claire and I stood at dusk to survive grief. Now it marked a bruise blooming on my daughter's arm, the sharp smell of blood mixed with dust, and she tried to act taller, pretending it didn't hurt. A line on a clipboard hadn't done that. A person had. Neighbors crept closer, uneasy. Sunblock and fear hung heavy. The guard looked to Marcus for cover. Behind me, a gate latch clicked, a stroller squeaked. I lifted the phone higher, catching badges, faces, yesterday's date on the posted rules. The frame itself told the story. Marcus dropped his voice to a threat. "Leave now, and I'll waive the fine. Stay, and your pool privileges vanish." "I don't bargain over injuries," I replied. "Document your choice for the record." He sneered. "You think the board will back you?" "I think daylight burns bullies," I said. Claire's shoulder brushed mine, her breath shaky but steady. I whispered, "We're leaving soon." But not before this is locked down. I stepped sideways to film the emergency protocol poster. Step 1 required verbal de-escalation. Step 2 required 2 staff present. Neither had happened. My lens lingered on the blank initials and timestamp. Chain of custody wasn't theory, it was muscle memory. I called the time aloud so the audio matched the metadata. Water slapped the edge. A child's laugh faltered into silence. The guard eyed my phone like it might bite. Marcus stiffened, realizing I'd shifted the ground without raising my voice. No chaos, just a record that couldn't be spun. "Where are you watching from?" I asked. Comments flickered in the corner of my eye. Local, lawyer, is she okay? Answered yes, because she was standing and because I needed to believe it. The evening sky burned copper. The lifeguard chair cast a crooked shadow across the deck. I raised the phone to frame Marcus in it. He finally broke, glancing toward neighbors who no longer looked like bystanders, but like a jury. A rules poster peeled loose in the breeze with a soft, papery sigh. I didn't smile. I didn't threaten. I pressed the screen, saw the checksum verify clean. Proof. They'd shoved a child into her mother's memory. They thought it would end at a fence. I would end it in daylight. Pressure always finds a seam. Tonight, I found mine. Neighbors lingered after the pool emptied, eyes following Marcus as he stalked away, keys jangling like a warning bell. I walked Claire home, her arm still pressed to her side. The faint outline of the fence rails reddened into her skin. She didn't complain, but I could feel the tremor in her step. The quiet streets of our gated neighborhood looked too polished, too rehearsed. The kind of place where manicured lawns tried to hide rot beneath the soil. By the time we reached our porch, the violation notice was already there. A crisp white sheet fluttering against the door, taped at the corner. Marcus's handwriting sprawled across the form, like it was a declaration of victory. Guest list infraction, fine pending. I tore it free and read it twice. The ink bled slightly from humidity, but the intent was sharp. They wanted me to bend. Claire slipped inside, dropping her towel on the rail where her mother used to hang them. I stayed outside a moment longer, listening. Sprinklers ticked in rhythm from a neighbor's yard. A dog barked 2 streets away. The night carried on as if nothing had happened, but the fence still lived in my mind, and the bruise on my daughter's arm was a pulse I couldn't ignore. I set the paper on the kitchen table and scanned the HOA's language. Marcus hadn't even used the standard template. He'd crossed out sections, rewritten fines, and left the witness line blank. Sloppy. It wasn't enforcement. It was theater. My wife had once called him a man addicted to clipboards, and now I saw what she meant. Control mattered more to him than rules themselves. The deeper truth was harder to swallow. This wasn't the first time. Over the past year, I'd overheard neighbors whisper about citations for trash cans 2 inches off schedule, paint samples rejected after weeks of review, even a child's lemonade stand shut down for commerce violations. It had always seemed like background noise, the kind of suburban nonsense you shrug off. But tonight, with Claire's shoulder marked red, it became something else. At the edge of the cul-de-sac, porch lights blinked on, one by one. People stepped out, hovering in doorways, speaking low. Word traveled fast in a place this controlled. I caught Mrs. Henson watching from across the street, lips pressed tight as she watered her begonias. She looked away quickly, but I could tell she'd seen enough to feel uneasy. That unease was the crack I needed. Inside, I sat at my desk and opened the HOA's public postings online. My badge wasn't necessary for access. It was all supposedly transparent. The archive told its own story, repeated safety violations, mostly against families, mostly vague. Marcus's name appeared on almost every one. His signature was the through line. The victory wouldn't come from fighting a fine. It would come from showing the pattern. People tolerated rules when they felt consistent, fair, predictable. But abuse, once exposed, bred revolt. My job had taught me that public trust collapses faster than any system. One leak, one spotlight, and the mask never goes back on. I printed the violation notice, pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, and began layering it with others I requested through the HOA's resident access portal. A timeline started to form, minor incidents escalating into tonight's shove. Claire leaned against the doorframe, silent, her hair damp and tangled. "Will they take the pool away?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "They already lost it tonight." She didn't understand yet, but she would. The fence bruise was more than an injury. It was evidence. It was the story neighbors had been waiting for. A story that proved Marcus's authority wasn't safety. It was abuse. I stared at the violation notice again. It wasn't just paper. It was the thread that tied dozens of whispered frustrations together. Tomorrow, I'd begin pulling. The morning came heavy, sunlight cutting through blinds as if trying to pry me out of sleep. I didn't fight it. My desk was still cluttered from the night before, violation notices stacked in a rough sequence like cards for a case no one had filed yet. The corkboard glared back at me, Marcus's signature repeated across them like a watermark. But what stayed sharper in my mind than ink or paper was the look on Elena Ruiz's face when she'd stepped back after the shove. I'd seen hesitation in people before, the slight stutter in motion, the eyes that dart instead of holding steady. She hadn't shoved Claire. She'd only followed Marcus's barked order to remove us. And when the fence rattled and Claire gasped, Elena had looked stricken, frozen, almost ready to protest, but silenced by the weight of Marcus standing over her. That moment mattered. A guard who doubts the orders she's carrying out becomes more than a pawn. She becomes a witness. By afternoon, the recreation center bustled again. Parents dragged coolers across the lot. Kids splashed and shrieked. Chlorine floated sharp in the heat. I walked past the pool, not to swim, but to watch. Elena sat near the entrance desk, clipboard balanced on her knees. Sunglasses hid her eyes, but her posture told the story. Shoulders hunched too far forward, pen tapping without rhythm. A kind of restless energy that betrayed unease. Marcus strutted nearby, talking loudly about new enforcement procedures, his voice carrying like he wanted every sunburnt neighbor to hear. He laughed too hard at his own remarks, the kind of laugh meant to cover cracks. Elena barely looked at him. She wrote something, erased it, wrote again. I slowed near the vending machines, pretending to fuss with change. From there, I could see her bite her lip, glanced toward the shallow end where kids kicked foam boards, then back at Marcus. When one of the parents approached with a minor question, Elena's tone was clipped, hurried, not anger, not rudeness, more like she was desperate to avoid another confrontation. That was the opening. I stepped closer, holding out the violation notice Marcus had slapped to my door. "This yours?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She blinked, pulled down the sunglasses. "No, that's board issued." But her eyes darted to Marcus before she answered, and the pen in her hand snapped under pressure. Half of it clattered to the tile. She bent quickly to retrieve it, but not before I saw the tremble in her fingers. "Marcus skipped the witness section," I said. "Funny, since you were standing right there." Her throat worked, but no words came. She capped what was left of the pen, then pressed it too firmly against the paper until the tip tore through. "You know what happened," I said, softer this time. "And you know it wasn't protocol." She inhaled sharply, then shook her head as though to clear it. Marcus's voice boomed again, talking about tightening the guest policy, and her shoulders hunched even lower. I didn't press further. Pressure would only harden the shell. Instead, I let the silence stretch, gave her space to sit in her own unease. The sound of kids splashing filled the gap. Chlorine burned my nose. Somewhere a lifeguard whistle pierced, shrill and brief. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, I do what I'm told." But her eyes said the opposite. They flicked once more toward the fence where Claire had been shoved, then back down to her clipboard. I left her there, unsettled, the image of her cracked pen and trembling hands burned into my memory. A witness torn between orders and conscience never stays neutral forever. It was only a matter of when she'd break, not if. As I walked away, the sun beat hot against the pavement, and the laughter from the pool felt strained, almost hollow. Beneath it all, the neighborhood simmered, and I knew the next crack in Marcus's facade would come from the person he thought he controlled most tightly. The laughter from the pool still echoed in my ears as I turned the corner onto my street. By the time I reached the house, the air felt different, thicker, charged. Something was waiting for me. The violation notice Marcus had taped to my door the night before hadn't been enough. He'd moved faster this time. On the porch sat a manila envelope, bold black letters stamped across it. Notice of hearing. I picked it up, the paper stiff with humidity, and scanned the contents. The board demanded my appearance at a disciplinary session to address repeated violations of community standards. They called it mandatory, though I knew better. These were scare tactics dressed up in legalese, meant to intimidate rather than inform. I carried the envelope inside, dropping it on the kitchen table next to Claire's half-finished cereal bowl. She was upstairs, probably still curled under the covers, trying to forget the sting of yesterday's shove. The bruise on her arm would last a week, maybe longer, but the memory would stretch further. I couldn't let her believe this was how authority worked. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, but not from fear, from anger. Marcus was escalating, dragging the fight from a public shove into an official board action. He thought he could smother outrage under procedure. What he didn't realize was that every page, every notice, every demand became another brick in the wall I was building against him. Later that afternoon, I walked into the HOA's office, a sterile converted unit at the edge of the neighborhood. The blinds were always half drawn, the carpet worn thin from too many dragged feet. The receptionist gave me a clipped smile, then slid another form across the counter. "You've been cited for non-compliance with guest policy," she said flatly. "Sign to acknowledge receipt." I took the pen, studied the paper. The citation had Marcus's fingerprints all over it. Vague accusations, inflated language, no substantiating detail. I signed, not because I agreed, but because acknowledgement was not admission. My training taught me that distinction mattered more than most people realized. On the wall behind her, a bulletin board displayed dozens of other notices, some yellowed from age, others fresh with crisp corners. Trash bin infractions, fence paint violations, lawn ornament removals. Names blacked out, but not thoroughly enough. Initials still peeked through. Families I knew had been through this theater too. As I left, I caught sight of Marcus emerging from his office, phone pressed to his ear. He glanced at me and smirked, mouthing the word checkmate. His confidence wasn't born of truth. It was performance, an act meant to make me doubt my footing. Outside, the late sun slanted over the asphalt. My reflection in the office window looked steady, unbroken. I pulled out my phone, snapping a photo of the bulletin board through the glass. Each citation pinned there was a puzzle piece, evidence of a larger design. One person could be painted as a troublemaker, but a pattern, spread across families, months, years, was something else entirely. I walked home slowly, absorbing the sights and sounds. Lawns perfectly trimmed, porches swept clean, flags hanging in exact alignment. Perfection at a glance, suffocation underneath. Neighbors eyed me from their windows, some curious, some wary, a few sympathetic. The story was spreading without my help. That was the thing about cracks in the facade. Once people saw one, they started to notice them everywhere. Back at the house, I pinned the new citation next to the first. The corkboard grew heavier, the narrative sharper. Claire padded into the kitchen, hair tangled, eyes still heavy with sleep. She looked at the wall of papers and frowned. "They're trying to bury us in rules," I told her. She touched her arm gently, then whispered, "Are you going to let them?" I shook my head. Not a chance. The notices weren't threats anymore. They were fuel. Marcus wanted escalation, and now he had it. What he didn't see was that every escalation gave me more to expose. Daylight was patient. It waited for enough weight to tip the balance, and I could already feel that moment coming. The corkboard loomed larger every time I passed it. A patchwork of fines and notices that looked less like governance and more like obsession. But it wasn't enough to feel that pattern. I needed to prove it. Patterns carried weight when they could be measured, not just remembered. That evening, I set up in my home office with Claire's laptop beside mine. The hum of the cooling fan filled the room as I logged into the HOA's public access portal. It was a clunky system, clearly patched together by someone without real training. Files weren't encrypted, timestamps were exposed, and metadata spilled out like crumbs on a table. To most residents, it was a wall of confusing documents. To me, it was a confession. I opened one violation record at random. The language was identical to mine, word for word, down to a misused clause about community safety. Another, different homeowner, different year, same language. It wasn't enforcement. It was copy and paste, Marcus's handwriting digitized. He'd built his power not on rules, but on repetition, wielding templates like weapons. I leaned closer, following the digital trail. Each file contained an edit log. Line after line showed revisions by admin MG. The initials were damning. Marcus hadn't just approved these notices, he'd authored them directly in violation of HOA protocol that required board consensus. My cursor hovered, the evidence glaring back at me. Claire's footsteps padded down the hall. She appeared at the doorway with a bowl of popcorn, her arm still wrapped in an elastic bandage. "You're still at it?" she asked. "Almost finished," I said, eyes on the screen. "You know what metadata is?" She shrugged. "Not really." "It's like fingerprints," I told her. "Every file carries them. Marcus left his all over these notices. That means he didn't just enforce rules, he made them up." She sat beside me, chewing slowly, eyes flicking between screens. "So, you can prove it?" "Not yet, but I can show the pattern hours blurred." As I compiled records, the stack on my corkboard was now mirrored digitally, each citation pulled, labeled, and time-stamped. When I lined them up chronologically, the escalation was undeniable. Minor infractions piled first, trash bins, lawn ornaments, fence paint. Then came harsher penalties, suspension threats, larger fines. And finally, cases like mine. Public humiliation disguised as safety enforcement. By midnight, I had a folder that told a story no neighbor had seen in full. It was bigger than me, bigger than Claire. Marcus had built a system designed to wear people down until they folded, isolated them so no one realized others were suffering the same treatment. That isolation was his power. Breaking it would be mine. The hum of the house at night pressed in, refrigerator clicking, pipes shifting, wind against the siding. I leaned back, rubbing tired eyes, but I couldn't shake the sound of the fence rattling when Claire hit it. The bruise on her arm was part of the same pattern, just flesh and blood instead of paper and ink. I exported the files into a single spreadsheet, careful to preserve timestamps. The column of admin MG edits stretched like a neon sign. No one could call it coincidence. No one could call it enforcement. It was control, naked and clumsy. Claire rested her head against my shoulder, already half asleep. "Are we gonna win?" she mumbled. "Yes," I said quietly, "because I've got something he can't erase." I glanced back at the corkboard, then at the glowing screens. The evidence was clean, airtight, undeniable. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about defending my daughter. It was about stripping away the illusion Marcus had built. He believed in clipboards and citations. I believed in truth laid bare, and truth had the louder voice when shown in the right light. The next step was obvious: organize, verify, and prepare to release. I didn't know if Elena would step forward yet, but even without her, the file spoke louder than Marcus's smirk ever could. I closed the laptop. The spreadsheet saved to multiple drives, mirrored to secure storage. The glow faded from the screen, but the evidence stayed alive, humming in silence, waiting. Marcus thought paper and threats could bury me. What he didn't know was that every line he wrote left a trail, and I had just followed it straight to him. The spreadsheet glowed in my mind long after I shut the laptop. Evidence alone wasn't victory. It had to connect to something visceral, something that reminded people these weren't just numbers on a screen. Marcus thrived because he made his victims feel alone. To break him, I needed to make the abuse personal for the community, the same way it had become personal for me. The next morning, I drove Claire to school and took the long way back. The neighborhood looked unnervingly pristine, hedges trimmed to identical heights, porches spotless, mailboxes polished. To an outsider, it looked idyllic. To those of us living inside it, the perfection was suffocating. I didn't turn toward home. Instead, I pulled into the small strip of grass that served as our community playground, the one built years earlier after residents fought the board for permission. The place was quiet now, swings rattling lightly in the breeze, mulch darkened by dew. My wife's name was carved into a bronze plaque at the edge of the slide, in memory of Sarah Whitmore, whose love of children built this dream. Claire had been 7 when Sarah organized the fundraiser, her laughter filling the air as volunteers hammered and painted. That playground had been a promise kept to a dying woman, and Marcus's board had almost killed it twice, trying to rezone the lot for parking expansion. I sat on the bench, phone in hand, scrolling through the spreadsheet again. Each violation, each threat, lined up in rows, dates stacked neatly. But what made it real wasn't the pattern. It was the plaque in front of me, the way Sarah's name gleamed in the rising sun. Marcus's system wasn't just harassment. It was an erasure of memory, of community, of love turned into rules and fines. My chest tightened as I thought about Claire. She was carrying grief already, and now the place where her mother had lived most vibrantly was turning hostile. The bruise on her arm wasn't just a mark from a fence. It was Marcus's signature, pressed into her skin as surely as on those notices. That was the breaking point. I couldn't wait for someone else to act. I opened my secure drive, double-checked the backups. Every file remained intact, every timestamp verified. My training told me this wasn't just evidence. It was admissible, traceable, unshakable. But my heart told me something else. Without the community, it wouldn't matter. Marcus would bury it under procedure, laugh it away behind closed doors. To win, I had to bring daylight in, and daylight came from numbers far larger than mine. A child's laugh carried across the lot as a young mother pushed a stroller past. She nodded politely but kept her eyes low, as if afraid to linger. Fear had soaked into the air here, subtle but constant. People avoided confrontation because they thought it only brought more punishment. That silence was Marcus's greatest weapon. I leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at Sarah's plaque. "I won't let it fade," I whispered. The words were barely sound, more breath than voice, but they anchored me. That afternoon, I stopped by the neighborhood's tiny library alcove, a repurposed shed where residents left books and notices. I slipped a printed chart inside the community board section. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just a simple timeline of citations, anonymized, showing the steady escalation of Marcus's violations. It wasn't my case alone. It was everyone's. I stepped back, watching through the car window as 2 neighbors paused to read it. Their heads leaned closer, fingers tracing the lines, murmurs growing sharper. One of them snapped a photo with her phone. Word would spread faster than I ever could. That was how rot was exposed, not with shouts, but with truth too obvious to ignore. When I got home, Claire was at the kitchen table sketching. She looked up and asked, "Did you do something today?" "Yes," I said, setting my phone down beside her. I started pulling the thread. Her eyes brightened in a way I hadn't seen since Sarah passed. She didn't need details. She only needed to know that the bruise on her arm wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The corkboard in my office waited, now heavier not just with notices, but with purpose. Marcus had chosen to escalate. I had chosen to answer. And for the first time, I knew daylight was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The corkboard in my office seemed to breathe with me that night. Each notice a heartbeat pounding against the wall. The air was heavy, stale with recycled tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was waiting for something to break. That's when my phone buzzed on the desk. A text, unknown number. "Can we talk?" "Not here." "Coffee shop, 9 a.m. "Tomorrow." No name, just a time and place. But I knew. The next morning, I left Claire at school and drove toward the strip mall on the edge of town. The coffee shop was one of those neutral grounds, bright lights, tinny music, the hiss of steamers drowning out private words. I sat by the window, ordered black coffee, and waited. Elena Ruiz walked in 10 minutes later. She wore her security polo, though her posture was far from confident. Shoulders hunched, eyes darting, fingers fidgeting with her key lanyard. She spotted me, hesitated, then slid into the booth across from mine. For a moment she said nothing. She twisted the lanyard, winding it tighter and tighter until it looked ready to snap. When she finally spoke, her voice barely carried over the whir of the espresso machine. "I shouldn't be here." "Then why are you?" I asked quietly. Her jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward the door as if Marcus might storm in. "Because what happened at the pool wasn't right. And I know it. I keep seeing her face, your daughter, when she hit that fence." She exhaled hard, shaking her head. It wasn't supposed to go that far. I stayed still, letting her wrestle with the weight. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her paper cup, holding it like it might steady her. "Marcus told me," she went on, voice low and quick. "He said, his exact words, make an example of them. He wanted everyone to see what happens when someone pushes back. He thinks if people are afraid, they won't question him. And for a while, that's worked." The words stung, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed everything I'd suspected. Fear wasn't just a byproduct of Marcus's system. It was the system. Elena pressed her cup so tight the lid popped slightly, a splash of coffee staining the table. She jumped, grabbed a napkin, muttered an apology. It was more than nerves. It was guilt. "You followed orders," I said. "But you didn't shove her. I know what I saw." She looked up sharply, eyes wide, vulnerable. "I could have stopped it. I should have said something. You're saying something now." She leaned closer, lowering her voice further. "Marcus changes the reports. I file incident logs, just like I'm trained to, but when they show up on the system, they're different. He edits them. He makes them harsher, makes the residents sound like threats. He tells me it's for liability, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's control. Always control." I let the silence sit, heavy, filled with clattering cups and the hum of refrigerators. Her confession wasn't just about Claire's bruise. It was about the mechanics of Marcus's power, the machinery behind the facade. It was the missing piece I needed. "Why tell me?" I finally asked. Her eyes flicked to the window, to the parking lot, then back. "Because I don't want to be part of it anymore. And because..." She hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. "Because I think he's going to do it again. To someone else." Soon her voice cracked on the last word, and I believed her. Not because of what she said, but because of the way her body betrayed her. The twitch of her foot, the tremor in her hands, the raw honesty in eyes that couldn't hold still. I pulled the napkin toward me, slid a pen from my pocket, and wrote a number. "If you're ready to step away from him, call this. It's a direct line. Everything you say will be preserved exactly as you said it. No edits, no Marcus." She stared at the napkin, lips pressed tight. Then she nodded once, sharp and small, like it was all she could manage. She tucked it into her pocket and stood. "I'll think about it." As she walked out, the bell over the door jingled softly. I watched her cross the lot, her shoulders still hunched, but her pace a fraction faster than when she'd walked in. A conflicted witness had become a key, not fully turned yet, but ready. Back at the booth, I let out a long breath. The confession added flesh to the bones of my evidence. Marcus wasn't just reckless, he was deliberate, calculated. And Elena had cracked his shield. The bruise on Claire's arm had been the start. Elena's words were the pivot. Now, Daylight had a witness. I left the coffee shop with Elena's confession echoing in my head. The smell of burnt espresso clung to my jacket, but it was the tremor in her voice that followed me into the parking lot. She hadn't fully crossed the line yet, but she'd leaned far enough for me to glimpse the truth. Marcus's empire wasn't built on rules. It was built on edits, on twisting records until reality bent to his will. And now I had proof that someone inside had seen it happen. The drive back to the county station felt like old muscle memory. I hadn't walked those halls much since shifting to remote work, but the badge on my lanyard still carried weight. The building itself was all brick and narrow windows, built more for storage than pride. Inside, the hum of servers filled the evidence lab like a second heartbeat. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, steady, unrelenting. I signed in and spread my files across a long table, paper notices on one side, digital logs pulled from the HOA portal on the other. Each bore Marcus's fingerprints, though he thought he'd buried them beneath protocol. Elena's words replayed. "He changes the reports." That was the key. I didn't just need the pattern, I needed to show the interference. With practiced fingers, I traced the metadata again. The logs didn't just confirm edits, they mapped them. Timestamps, user IDs, line-by-line changes. I opened one file, my violation notice. The system showed two versions. The first had been bland, neutral, logged by Elena at 7:12 p.m. The second, edited by admin MG at 7:24 p.m., was longer, harsher, and carried the language Marcus had used at the pool. That discrepancy was gold. Elena's raw log proved she had filed it by the book. Marcus's edit showed intent, manipulation. It was the smoking gun. I compiled a side-by-side record, highlighting every alteration. Then I did the same for half a dozen other citations. The result was damning. Residents weren't misbehaving more. Marcus was rewriting their behavior into something dangerous. And once it was filed under his version, neighbors backed down, convinced they had no defense. The realization sat heavy but empowering. This wasn't about winning one case. It was about showing everyone they had been living under a lie. By late afternoon, I'd packaged the data into a secure evidence folder. Screenshots, metadata exports, audio commentary synced to each file, so no one could accuse me of fabrication. The chain of custody was sealed tighter than any courtroom exhibit. As I stepped out of the lab, the weight of the folder on my encrypted drive felt heavier than any weapon. This was the counterplan. Not shouting, not threats, not angry meetings with Marcus. Just daylight. Cold, unarguable daylight. Driving back through the neighborhood, I noticed things I hadn't before. 2 houses with shutters closed midday. A swing set in one yard, sitting unused, its chains squeaking in the wind. People weren't just annoyed by Marcus. They were retreating, shrinking into themselves, afraid to live openly in a place they paid to belong. That was what his edits had done. They didn't just create rules, they created silence. When I pulled into the driveway, Claire was sitting on the porch steps sketching. She looked up and smiled faintly, though the bandage still wrapped her arm. "You look like you solved something," she said. I sat beside her, watching. The sun sink behind the rooftops. "Not solved," I answered. "Prepared." She didn't ask for details, and I didn't give them. Some truths were too heavy for a teenager to carry. But she leaned against me, and for the first time since Sarah's plaque caught the morning sun, I felt the tilt of power shifting back. Inside, I pinned Elena's napkin number above the corkboard, not as evidence, but as reminder. She hadn't testified yet, but her struggle had cracked the wall enough for me to see through. With her words and my files, the narrative wasn't mine alone. It belonged to every neighbor who'd ever whispered about Marcus in fear. The strategy was no longer about defense. It was offense now. I wasn't waiting for Marcus to escalate. I was setting the ground where he would fall. The corkboard in my office had grown into something unrecognizable. Layers of citations, screenshots, timelines, and now the napkin with Elena's number pinned in the center like a compass. But strategy didn't belong in private rooms anymore. Marcus's power fed on secrecy, and I knew the only way forward was to put the truth where everyone could see it. I chose the backyard barbecue as the setting. It was neutral ground, not an official meeting hall where Marcus could control the stage, and not inside my home where he could accuse me of plotting in secret. Just a neighbor's grill, folding chairs, and paper plates, harmless on the surface, subversive underneath. By late Saturday afternoon, smoke drifted across the cul-de-sac, carrying the smell of burgers and charred vegetables. Kids chased each other through sprinklers, laughter piercing the stale quiet that had ruled our streets too long. I'd helped organize this under the guise of a summer send-off. Marcus never paid attention to things that didn't have a line item on his ledger. That was his blind spot. I arrived with Claire at my side, laptop bag slung over one shoulder. She wore a sleeveless shirt despite the faint bruise still visible, a quiet act of defiance I didn't comment on. We moved through clusters of neighbors, handshakes and nods, the air buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt in months. People weren't here just for food. They were here because something unspoken was about to happen. When the plates were stacked and conversation slowed, I set the laptop on a patio table under the shade of a maple tree. The crowd shifted, curious. Some leaned in, others hung back, arms crossed, waiting to see if this was just another rant against the HOA or something more. I opened the folder. The spreadsheet filled the screen, rows of citations stacked like a wall. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I highlighted 2 records side by side, one filed by Elena at 7:12 p.m., neutral and procedural. The second, Admin MG, edited 12 minutes later, transformed into a weapon. Gasps broke the quiet. A woman in a red blouse muttered, "That was my trash can violation." Another man shook his head, pointing. "That's mine." I knew it didn't match what I'd signed. I explained nothing in legal terms. I didn't need to. I just showed the edits, line by line, timestamp by timestamp, until the pattern spoke for itself. Each citation was another thread, and together they wove a net that showed Marcus's hand guiding every punishment. Claire stood close, her eyes sweeping over the neighbors' faces as recognition dawned. I could see relief mixing with anger. Relief that they weren't crazy, that they weren't alone, and anger that one man had orchestrated it all. The grill hissed as fat dripped onto coals. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking what was happening. The mother didn't answer, her focus locked on the screen. "This is how he keeps control," I said finally, voice steady but quiet. "By rewriting your lives until you question your own memories. But the truth is right here. He didn't just enforce rules, he invented them." Murmurs swelled into sharper voices. One neighbor demanded to know what could be done. Another suggested calling the county. Someone else cursed under their breath, shaking their head like years of pent-up frustration were finally spilling free. I didn't push them. This wasn't about rallying with speeches. It was about letting the weight of the evidence settle on their shoulders. When people see daylight for the first time after years in shadow, you don't force them forward. You let their own eyes adjust. Claire leaned against me, whispering, "They believe you." "They believe themselves," I corrected softly. I just gave them the mirror. As the evening waned, neighbors left in clusters, quieter than when they'd arrived, but carrying something new. Determination, questions, a refusal to accept Marcus's theater without scrutiny. The files had done their work, spreading like sparks on dry grass. When the grill smoke cleared and only embers glowed, I packed the laptop away. Claire walked beside me, her shoulders squared. The bruise still marked her skin, but her expression was different now, proud, certain. At home, I pinned a printout of the spreadsheet to the corkboard, not for my benefit anymore, but as a reminder. The strategy was no longer in the preparation phase. The community was awake, and once awake, they wouldn't go back to sleep. The spreadsheet hung on my corkboard like a declaration, but evidence alone wasn't the endgame. Marcus still had control of the boardroom, the bylaws, the microphone. To dismantle him, the timing had to be precise. The truth had to drop when the community was watching, when his performance couldn't drown it out. That chance came faster than expected. A week after the barbecue, an email hit my inbox. Mandatory hearing. Whitmore family violations. Attendance required. Location, Community Recreation Hall. Saturday, 7 p.m. Marcus had chosen his battleground. What he didn't realize was that he'd also chosen his stage. Saturday evening, I walked toward the rec hall with Claire at my side. The building stood at the center of the neighborhood, a squat brick box with flickering lights over the entrance and a row of metal chairs stacked along the wall. It smelled faintly of old carpet and chlorine from the pool next door. Through the windows, I could see the board seated at the long table, Marcus at the center in his blazer, papers spread before him like props. Neighbors filed in behind us, more than I expected. The barbecue had stirred something, and whispers had flown through cul-de-sacs all week. Some came curious, others angry, a few still wary, but they came. That alone was a shift. Inside, the air was close, heavy with the buzz of cheap fluorescent lights. I set Claire in the front row, where she could see everything, but wouldn't be in Marcus's line of fire. Then I took my place against the side wall, laptop bag slung casually over my shoulder. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice smooth but rehearsed. We're here tonight to address ongoing violations by Mr. Whitmore and his family. Repeated infractions, disregard for guest policies, disruption of pool safety. His eyes flicked toward me with smug confidence. This hearing will determine appropriate penalties. A few neighbors shifted uneasily. The words were familiar. Marcus had recited versions of them for years. But this time, something in the room was different. People weren't just listening, they were waiting. I pulled out my laptop, opened the drive, and let the screen cast its glow against the wall. I didn't speak yet. Timing mattered. Marcus continued with his script, waving his stack of papers, citing bylaws. His voice droned like a metronome, steady and certain. He thought this was his show. When he paused to sip water, I stepped forward. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor drew eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Before you decide anything about my family, the community deserves to see how these violations are made. I clicked, and the projector I'd brought lit up the wall. The spreadsheet appeared, bright and undeniable. Side-by-side edits filled the screen. Elena's neutral logs on the left. Marcus's altered versions on the right. Timestamps glared in red. Admin MG at the bottom of every edit. Gasps rippled through the room. A man in the back muttered, "That's my fence citation." A woman near the aisle pointed, whispering to her neighbor. The room shifted from passive to electric in a breath. Marcus shot to his feet. "This is unauthorized data. It's private." "No," I cut in, my voice steady. "These are public records, required by law to be accessible to every resident. All I did was show what was already there. What you don't control are the edit logs." He froze, lips pressing thin. The confidence slipped, replaced with something rawer. Fear. The board members flanked him, shifting. Uncomfortably, they'd let Marcus run unchecked for too long, but now the evidence painted them as complicit. Their eyes darted toward the crowd, toward neighbors whose faces had hardened into anger. I let the silence build, the weight of the edits filling the room louder than any speech. On the screen, Marcus's own signature glared like a spotlight. "Every notice you've received," I said, turning to the crowd, "wasn't enforcement. It was theater. He rewrote your lives to keep you afraid. But you don't have to be." The projector hummed, papers rustled. Somewhere in the back, someone clapped once, sharp and defiant. Others joined, not applause for me, but a rhythm against Marcus's silence. I glanced at Claire. She sat straighter, eyes bright, the bruise long faded, but her pride glowing stronger. The board called for order, but order had already shifted. Marcus had lost control of the room. My files had made sure of it. The clapping grew louder, uneven but insistent, rolling through the hall like a storm gathering speed. Marcus slammed his palm against the table, but the sound was drowned beneath the murmurs and the swelling voices of neighbors who had seen enough. For years, they had sat through meetings where his words carried the weight of law. Tonight, the projector's glow stripped him bare, and no amount of gavel banging could stitch his authority back together. "Quiet!" Marcus barked, face flushed. "This is a formal hearing. None of this is admissible." But the crowd didn't quiet. A man in the back row stood, voice clear and hard. "That's my signature on the left log. I never said half of what he added." He jabbed a finger toward the screen, anger bright on his face. "You lied about me." Others followed. A mother in a blue sundress clutched her citation, holding it up like evidence in a trial. "You said I endangered children with a lemonade stand." "That's not what the log says." Elena's version says, "I filed a guest event request." All eyes turned to Elena, who had slipped in at the back of the room. She stood frozen, but her body betrayed the truth. Hands clasped tight, shoulders stiff, eyes flicking nervously toward Marcus. For a long moment, silence pressed against her like a weight. Then she lifted her chin and spoke, voice trembling but clear. "He's right. I filed the reports by the book. Marcus changed them." The room erupted. Some gasped, others shouted. The board members shifted in their seats, suddenly desperate to distance themselves from the man at the center of the storm. One of them whispered furiously into another's ear. Marcus spun toward Elena, eyes blazing, but she didn't flinch. Her fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms, yet she stood taller than I had ever seen her. I stepped forward, voice rising above the chaos without shouting. "This isn't about one fine or one family. This is about all of us. Every person in this room has felt it, rules bent into weapons, citations twisted until they broke you down. He's kept us divided, made you think you were alone. But look around. You're not heads turned, neighbors locking eyes across the rows, recognition passing between them like fire catching dry leaves. The weight of years lifted into a sudden rush of collective anger. Marcus grabbed the microphone, knuckles white. "This meeting is over." "No, Marcus," someone shouted from the front row. "You're over." The words sparked something irreversible. Voices rose, overlapping, no longer whispers of discontent, but demands shouted into the stale air. "Resign," one called. "Step down," another yelled. The chant grew, filling the hall with a rhythm stronger than Marcus's gavel. "Resign, resign, resign." Claire sat forward, eyes wide, a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. She was watching the shift happen in real time. The same neighbors who had turned away when she was shoved now stood shoulder to shoulder, united in outrage. The board chair, pale and sweating, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should recess." But the crowd roared back. "No recess! Vote him out." I didn't need to push. The evidence had done its work. Elena's voice had cracked the dam, and now the community was flooding through. I simply stood steady, letting the moment carry itself. Marcus shouted over the din, his voice breaking. "You think you can remove me? You need procedure. You need bylaws." "Bylaws require trust," I answered, calm but cutting. "And you don't have it anymore." Silence fell, sudden and sharp. His face twisted, searching for footing, but none remained. The room wasn't his courtroom anymore. It was a jury, and the verdict was written in their eyes. Neighbors surged forward, not violently, but with the force of a tide that couldn't be stopped. The board chair stammered, then finally conceded, "A special vote will be scheduled immediately." The roar that followed rattled the windows. For the first time in years, it wasn't Marcus's voice filling the hall. It was theirs. I caught Elena's gaze across the room. She exhaled shakily, then nodded once, the smallest gesture of solidarity. Claire leaned against me, whispering so only I could hear, "He's finished." And she was right. The confrontation wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the community, and Marcus's reign had collapsed under the weight of his own edits. The roar of voices still vibrated in my chest long after the meeting ended. Neighbors spilled out of the recreation hall, their conversations electric, their steps lighter than I had ever seen. For years they had bowed their heads to Marcus, clipped their words, trimmed their lives down to fit the narrow mold he demanded. Tonight, they walked out taller. Marcus lingered behind, flanked by board members who no longer looked at him with admiration, but with thinly veiled disgust. He barked, something I couldn't hear over the din, but it didn't matter. The spell was broken. Once a community finds its voice, no gavel can silence it again. Claire clutched my hand as we stepped into the night air. The pool glistened under the floodlights, rippling quietly, a sharp contrast to the chaos inside. She looked at the fence where she had been shoved, her lips pressed tight. "It feels different now," she whispered. "It is different," I said. "That fence isn't a weapon anymore. It's proof of what we stood up to." By the next week, the momentum couldn't be stopped. Flyers circulated announcing the special vote. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact knocked on doors, canvassing like it was a local election. The same people Marcus had isolated into silence were now bound together by fury and resolve. On the night of the vote, the rec hall overflowed. Folding chairs ran out, families stood shoulder to shoulder, children perched on their parents' laps. Elena sat near the front, her uniform traded for a plain jacket, her posture straighter than I'd seen. When her name was called, she rose and repeated her confession into the microphone. Her voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each sentence. By the time she finished, the applause nearly lifted the roof. The vote was swift, 90% in favor of removal. Marcus didn't wait for the results to be read aloud. He stormed out the side door, his keys jangling like the last note of a song no one wanted to hear again. The board announced interim leadership and immediate reforms. Security oversight by a neutral third party, transparent posting of all future violations, and a review of every citation Marcus had ever filed. Neighbors embraced, shook hands, and for the first time, spoke without fear of who might be listening. Days later, a smaller ceremony was held at the pool. Claire stood beside me as a maintenance worker, repainted the section of fence where she'd been shoved. A plaque was fastened beside the gate, dedicated not to Marcus's rules but to my late wife's legacy. In memory of Sarah Whitmore, whose love of community still protects us. The crowd that gathered wasn't large, but it was sincere. Tears glistened on more than one face, mine included. Elena approached afterward, her hands no longer trembling. "I'm leaving security," she told me, "but I'll stay here. This place deserves better, and I want to be part of it." I nodded, knowing how hard that decision had been. "You already are," I said. Claire dipped her toes into the pool that evening, laughing for the first time in weeks. The bruise on her arm had faded, but something stronger had replaced it: pride. She knew the story wasn't just about her pain. It was about a community waking up, about people refusing to be silent any longer. As the sun set, the water caught fire in gold and crimson. I thought of Sarah, of the lessons she left behind, of the laughter she carved into. These streets. For the first time since losing her, I felt like her memory wasn't slipping away. It was stronger now, carried not just by me and Claire, but by every neighbor who had stood up in that hall. Marcus had believed fear was unshakable. He was wrong. Fear only lasts until someone dares to shine light on it. And once daylight comes, it never leaves. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.